Greetings to all. I'm so happy that we still were able to have the colloquium this year. It is always great to be connected with a global community of thought leaders, researchers, practitioners who are committed to advancing Black males in education and beyond. In the past, we have convened the colloquium literally all around the world, like United Kingdom, Jamaica, Bermuda, and Ireland, as well as many cities across the United States, like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Atlanta, Georgia. These sorts of singular gatherings are so crucial for the kind of work we do. Who better to learn from and bounce ideas off of than your peers from around the country and other parts of the world? I'm convinced that the work we do has never been more critical to expanding the opportunities for Black males and, more importantly, for eliminating anti-Blackness racism in our society. Let me explain why. Because there has never been a greater need in this world for human talent and inclusion than there is today. The stakes have never been higher for solutions. We need to tap the brainpower of scholars from every background to solve the world's biggest problems, including anti-Blackness racism. The greatest challenges that lie ahead, how to best to adapt to climate change, turn toward renewable energy, and feed an increasingly crowded planet will only be solved with the best minds from every zip code involved. Yet we face the stubborn and familiar adversaries of racial bigotry, seeking to divide us and block the road to greater human understanding and cooperation. Now more than ever, this country, or shall I say the world, needs those who can synthesize facts and learn across boundaries with empathy and understanding. That means the work we do, studying how to bridge and eliminate educational disparities among Black males, is so very important. We need bridges that help us expand opportunities and explore historical contexts, not walls that keep us in self-contained silos. These are the issues that haunt this age, and they must be tackled by the people like you all across this world. By nature, I am a hopeful person, and every time I spend quality time with individuals like yourself, I do feel my spirits being lifted. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice, so we must trust that we will see brighter days on the horizon soon. Like you, I am unable to predict the future. With the wrath of COVID-19 upon us, I'm unable to determine if we will be able to resume the colloquium in its original form as the past. But I am confident, regardless of the situation, that we will continue to coordinate the colloquium, whether it's virtually done or whether it's being executed face to face. In closing, I want to thank all of our presenters for being a part of our virtual journey, and thank all of the individuals within the We Lab as well as the Bell National Resource Center on the African American Male for making this event happen. Stay safe, and more important, always keep making excellence a priority. Take care.
Greetings. I'm Brian Burke, Assistant Professor of Higher Education in the Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis Department at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. I also serve as Research Scientist in the Wisconsin's Equity and Inclusion Laboratory, also known as the We Lab. I'm grateful to be here at the International Colloquium, especially during this time of dual pandemics. Things are tough, but for me, the colloquium always comes at the right time. I have been attending the colloquium since 2014, when I first started my faculty career, and have been fortunate to bring graduate students to the colloquium for a number of years. To me, the colloquium has always provided a safe, intellectually invigorating, intergenerational space where I leave feeling recharged and recommitted to advancing the work of improving the educational experiences and outcomes for Black males. Just as an example, nearly every article that I've published was first workshopped at a past colloquium. The supportive feedback that I received from faculty colleagues, mentors, graduate and undergraduate students, practitioners, and community members, all in the audience, helped to strengthen my work and helped me to ensure that my work has broad applicability across audiences. In this sense, the colloquium has served as an invaluable incubator for advancing my ideas. In this regard, the intellectual and supportive space provided by the colloquium is unparalleled to any other conference or convening that I regularly attend. Naturally, this year's virtual format is different, but no less intellectually rich. This year's timely theme about the dual pandemics of racial uprising and COVID-19 makes it necessary for us to double down on working for the educational plight of Black people. Equally important, the state of the world makes it that much more imperative that we find creative ways to work together to support one another and continue the fight to dismantle the systems and structures designed to oppress us. That's, to me, what this colloquium represents, even in its virtual format. I send you well wishes and positive vibes as you continue working for equity and inclusion. Enjoy the remainder of the colloquium.
Black communities are more depressed than other communities. We have to look at why.
African American males are among the most disadvantaged group in American society. They are much more likely to grow up in female-headed households, are less likely to have role models to help them in their development of what it means to become a man. In communities which are ridden with violence, violent behavior may serve as the model for what manhood is.
As Black men, there's an idea of masculinity that oftentimes is misleading, that we've been led to believe is how we have to act to assert ourselves. We had to develop certain other ideas of masculinity that often are very hypermasculine, very aggressive, and leave no room for vulnerability. And I believe that leads us to a place where we're not able oftentimes to be open and be honest about things going on in our brain because we don't want to appear weak, and you feel that if you give any sign of weakness that you'll be torn down.
Trying to unbox this whole notion of being invincible and not showing any vulnerability, because at the core of it, we all feel everything that happens to us.
We're taught that at a very young age, that we're supposed to, suck it up and just keep moving, and you got it in you, And that attitude is disempowering, and it's harmful.
Well, Black men and boys are more likely to be misdiagnosed and less likely to receive the appropriate level of care, even when they seek services. The additional effects of hypermasculinity make this doubly challenging for this population. Black men and boys continue to be denied their tears and their emotions.
A few years back, I was suffering from depression for over a year. And at the time, I didn't even know what it was. Mental illness, it was associated with, oh, this person's crazy, or it was often associated with people who are criminals. So that's something that I kept to myself. To be dead honest with you guys, I didn't know there was actually that much services out there. I had no idea. I just thought, hey, this is a part of life.
I think it's more difficult for Black people, especially Black young people, to access mental health, because I see in schools when people will say, okay, this young person needs help, it tends to be, if it's a Black young person that's being referred to me, they need help because they're angry, because they're, falling off, because they're going to fail, whereas the white girls that I work with tend to be referred to me because they have mental health issues.
I think one of the biggest things with the stigma attached to mental health is just a lack of knowledge of it.
Growing up in a family where we had several people that had mental illnesses, but we didn't talk about it, as I grew older, I learned that not talking about it was hurting us.
And you've got white people telling Black people how you should deal with your trauma, how you should deal with your issues. You can't do that. And that's why there needs to be diversity, not just on the ground floor, not just those that are doing the groundwork, but on every single level, in every system, every institution. There has to be representation. Hello, my name is Brandon Britt, and I am a program manager with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion Young Scholars Program and second-year PhD student studying educational administration at The Ohio State University. I had the honor of attending the very first colloquium back in 2012 as an undergraduate student, and so it is truly an honor to be before you all again to introduce to you all our next speaker, Dr. Shanna M Cooper. Dr. Cooper is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience and director of the Strengths, Assets, and Resilience Lab at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is also an RTI University Scholar at the Center on Social Determinants, Risk Behaviors, and Prevention Science. After 9 years as an assistant and associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of South Carolina, Dr. Cooper joined UNC's Developmental Psychology area in 2017. Her research examines racial and cultural contexts of development with a specific focus on African American children, adolescents, and families. Dr. Cooper's areas of expertise include how race-related experiences are related to health and well-being, the cultural context of parenting, and community-level risk and protective factors. Her recent work examines contextual and psychosocial factors associated with African American fathers, parenting, and involvement. Dr. Cooper's research has been funded by several agencies and organizations, including the National Science Foundation and National Institute of Children, Health, and Human Development. Her work spans multiple areas and has been published in a variety of scientific journals. Dr. Cooper is committed to the translation of her research, including the development of culturally specific, family-focused prevention programming. Dr. Cooper's service leadership reflects a commitment to the promotion of positive development among racial, ethnic, minority children, families, and striving towards equity. Currently, she is associate editor for Child Development and on the editorial boards for multiple scientific journals. Dr. Cooper is a member of the Society for Research and Children Development's Equity and Justice Committee, as well as the Society for Research and Adolescence Consensus Committee and past chair of the Society for Research and Children Development's Black Caucus. It is now an honor to introduce to you all Dr. Shauna Cooper.
Hi, I am Shauna Cooper, an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I am excited to be able to share some of my work with ICBME 2020 regarding how we can promote positive well-being among Black men and boys, fathering and community engagement as critical context for health and development. Before I get into my talk, I wanted to provide a roadmap for today's discussion. I will first situate the well-being among Black men and boys, including both risk, promotive, and protective factors that impact well-being, but thinking about this from a lifespan perspective. Then also talk about intergenerational processes, as well as ways that we can harness community assets and strengths. As we talk about ways to promote the well-being of Black boys, we must also consider how we support fathers and men as they support the next generation. And given the current moment that we're in, these unprecedented times, I will talk briefly about well-being among not just Black men and boys, but what this means for Black families and communities more broadly, and also what this might mean beyond. And then in my talk today with some key take-home points. So I like to begin every talk with guiding questions that orient the talk within the broader discussion of key issues. So today's guiding questions, and what I often say, guiding questions for today, guiding questions for every day. So question number 1, how does the broader racial context shape fathering and well-being among Black men? 2, how might father figure relationships and community engagement operate as health promotive and protective factors? So thinking about what we know in terms of the well-being of Black boys, we know that several studies have identified factors that impact the health and well-being of Black boys very early in the lifespan all the way to adulthood years. Some of those studies have indicated the impact of unaffirming and often hostile educational and learning spaces, as well as law enforcement hypervisibility and criminalization. Studies have also noted structural inequities, social and/or racial inequities that also have both indirect and direct impacts on well-being. As we talk about risks that have implications for well-being, health, and development of Black boys, we must also understand pathways to positive development. What are key strengths and assets, as well as key adaptive processes among Black boys and men. And also, as we talk about ways to promote positive development, pathways to positive development, we must also identify supports, spaces, and structures that foster what many call the brilliance of Black boys and young men. As we talk about ways to promote well-being, we must center the discussion and frame the discussion within a lifespan approach. And that a lifespan approach is critical to supporting the mental health, well-being, and positive development of Black boys, but it's also key for identifying social determinants or the roles of social determinants and their impacts across the lifespan. And as we talk about the childhood, adolescent, young adulthood experiences of Black boys and young men, we must also highlight the roles and contributions of men, fathers, and our father figures. And we must do so from a strengths-based perspective. So as we continue to talk about how the broader racial context shapes the health, well-being, and mortality of Black men, we must also seek to understand how these experiences shape their parenting, both in terms of their ideologies and actual parenting behaviors. And the broader literature has talked about the impact of various levels of racism, structural, institutional, individual, and cultural racism, for example, and highlighting the quotidian nature of racial discrimination and microaggressions. And given this quotidian nature, we must again also understand what this means for Black fathers. And as we seek to understand how race-related experiences, race-related processes shape parenting, we must reflect their own voices and center their experiences. So as we seek to better understand ways that we can promote positive well-being for Black men and boys, we must also think about intergenerational processes. And I will, as we talk about intergenerational processes, I will anchor this discussion with a quote from one of the fathers from our focus groups. This father says, "I don't always know if I'm telling them the right thing, but I built it from my experience." And so I wanted to use this quote to anchor a discussion on intergenerational processes because it highlights the transactional nature as well as the reciprocality, and that fathers' assessment of their experiences are a lens for how they understand their own parenting roles, but then they also layer on their assessments of what their children, both sons and daughters, may need to navigate their social spaces. So some of my work has sought to identify and examine key mechanisms. So what are the factors that explain how these intergenerational experiences shape involvement? Also, what are the ways in which this has implications for mental health and well-being? And so when I talk about intergenerational experiences, this can be conceptualized broadly. These are our important social relationships that happen earlier in our life, but are reinforced throughout the lifespan. So this could be relationships with parents, parental caregivers, grandmother, aunts and uncles, other blood relatives, other fictive kin, and really I think the point is that these are key individuals who shape development, both directly and indirectly. And so some of my work has highlighted fatherhood ideologies as a key mechanism. So how fathers view their broader perspectives around what fathers do. Should fathers be as actively engaged in the lives of their children? Are fathers just as important as mothers? And so our work shows that fathers who were more actively engaged, and again, this is not a discussion about residential status. We see the same pattern holding for fathers who lived with their children, residential fathers, and fathers who were non-residential. And so it really came down to fathers who were actively engaged in involvement rather than where they lived. And so fathers that reported having fathers that were actively engaged in their life in various ways, communication, actual involvement, also endorsed more actively engaged fatherhood ideologies. And fathers who endorsed these more active engagement fatherhood ideologies were more likely to be involved with their children across various dimensions. And in fact, these fathers were what I consider to be multifaceted in their involvement. So not just doing activities, but being involved in school, being involved in learning at home. So there again speaks to how these active engagement fatherhood ideologies has implications for involvement as it is a multi-dimensional construct. Some of my work has also highlighted self-efficacy, which is an ideology, but it is a personally held ideology. And so these are fathers' beliefs about their ability to carry out, to engage in their confidence about their ability to be a father, to do father, however they define father-related things. And so our work has highlighted that these intergenerational experiences also shape fathers' self-efficacy about their fathering role. And that we see that fathers who have greater self-efficacy report greater well-being, also with respect to more positive mental health outcomes. And so as we talk about sort of these broader ideologies, it's also important to account for race-related experiences and processes and what this might mean for fathers, how they make sense and how they make meaning around the fathering role, but also how do fathers interpret this in relation to being a Black father. So one way that we've asked this is this broader question. How might fathers' assessment of the larger social environment shape parenting concerns and involvement? And so some of our fathers have highlighted it in terms of safety and risk, but they've also talked about opportunities. So their awareness of opportunities in the environment for their children that will help them excel in school, to do well in other aspects. So our work, qualitative work, and we see this panning out in several of our samples of Black fathers and families, but that fathers note concerns about raising their sons and daughters. And today I will focus specifically on concerns for raising their sons. I can do almost an exact presentation with respect to Black girls. So that fathers have concerns for raising their sons, and that these concerns map onto strategies and engagement with their children, and that we're also seeing linking some of our family data. So we have fathers, mothers, and adolescents who are reporting on some of these, is that it is linked to this engagement, is also linked to boys' well-being. And so as we talk about implications for Black boys and men, what we see is that fathers are report strategic involvement, and that given their assessment of concerns for their sons, and what is needed to help them thrive, fathers begin to think about what their strategies will be to reduce risk, to increase safety, however they define safety and risk in their environmental context, but also ways to capitalize on opportunities in their communities and our social environments. And again, this speaks to not just the mental health and well-being of boys, but it also speaks to the well-being and mental health of fathers. And that fathers who feel more efficacious around developing strategies as well as engaging with their children are more likely to report greater well-being. So the figure on the right is really the culmination of all the many themes that our fathers noted in our many focus groups. And while I will not be able to go into detail in my talk today, feel free to look at the paper and see the various ways in which these concerns and strategies emerged. And again, I think it really highlights the complexity in which fathers are making sense of their role as fathers, but also Black fathers. So some of the prominent themes that emerged that are relevant for today's discussion is that fathers reported awareness and larger concerns around negative imagery of Black families, particularly the portrayal of Black fathers. And as they talked about engaging in their fathering roles, they also made the differentiation between their fathering ideology and their ideology with respect to being a Black father. So their roles as a Black father for raising Black children. And they did this primarily from a gendered lens. So differentiating between concerns for their sons and daughters, but also strategies to promote positive development and enhance well-being for their sons versus their daughters. So this is just a quick synopsis of the main concerns noted by fathers. So this fits, I think, very nicely within the existing literature. Fathers highlighted incongruent and unsupportive school contexts, risk avoidance and safety, and the importance of fathers and father figures, and the availability of fathers and father figures in the lives of Black boys. So this particular father, I think this quote really is a good example of the complexity and of fathers' synopsis, assessment of the broader social structure, their social environment, but also the ways in which they are thinking about helping their children navigate, and what they must do as fathers to help their children navigate these spaces. So this father says, I'm not going to read the entire quote, but he says, we have to guide our children in such a way because they can't. Particularly our sons and our daughters too, but particularly our sons. There are things that they just can't do that other kids can do, and it be okay. Later in the passage he says, but I think it needs to be more visible that we do love them, that we can nurture them, and that it's important to connect with them emotionally, spending time with them, playing sports, doing whatever. And so again, this highlights fathers' awareness of the broader social structure, but the ways in which they are using collective strategies to help their children thrive, to promote well-being among their sons. So as we talk about fathers' assessments of what's happening with their children, the broader social structure in relation to their children, fathers often connect that to their own experiences. And so since our focus groups, we have seen this pan out in all of our survey data, and what I think is a very, very intricate way of how fathers' own experiences become a lens for how they make sense of their children's experiences, but also the ways in which they develop strategies and strategic involvement in the lives of their children. So one of our fathers talks about childhood experiences. And so this quote is, I think, a powerful reflection of how these early experiences shaped even his lens for what he should do with his children in terms of advocacy. So this quote is, and I was in the college prep class, the only black male in the class, and one of my white classmates was like, you know, you could be president one day. And before I could say it, one of my white classmates laughed and said, no, we can't. And I agree with him because I didn't think that was something that was possible. One of our other fathers talks about the broader statistics with respect to black boys and black men, and how they have observed this play out with their own sons. So this father says, when I look at the statistics of African American males, they want us to perpetuate that. And I've watched my sons when they want to participate in things, how they're put at the back of the class and put at the end of the line. So fathers' awareness of the broader social structure, in this case, statistics, likely educational statistics as it relates to black boys, and what this means for his own son's experiences within his educational spaces. But I also think that their observation, I've watched my sons, also highlights how fathers make sense of their own experiences as well as their parenting experiences, as well as they help their children begin to make sense of their own experiences. Another quote, which I think is really powerful, is that our sons, they're treated like they're second class, and I've dealt with that too. And you're talking about going to the school. So this quote is an example of fathers' awareness of their experiences of their sons in educational spaces. And also this father noted that he also dealt with this. And he finishes the quote with advocacy in action. And he says, and you're talking about going to the school. So meaning that he's aware of these issues also happen to him, which means as a parent, he must advocate and act in a way that will ensure that these things do not continue for his son in his school context. So again, fathers' own race-related experiences can be a lens for interpreting the experiences of their sons. And as we see in some of our current work and current survey data, is that coping appears to be an important mechanism for understanding these impacts. So how fathers cope with their own experiences and how these coping strategies enhance their engagement, their involvement with their children. And that some of our qualitative data suggests that fathers who had not fully coped with their own racial traumas had difficulty discussing these issues with their children, particularly their boys. And so we see that coping and the race-related experiences themselves can profoundly impact fathers' own stress and well-being. And that coping, again, thinking about how this connects to self-efficacy, could also have implications for fathers' involvement, right? So fathers who may not know if they're saying the right thing, or not wanting to say the wrong thing. So again, thinking about how this may manifest in a parenting and or intergenerational context. So quickly, some of our work has sought to think about the intergenerational transmission of coping via parenting and involvement. So I'm not going to go over all the specific findings, but one of our recent papers in the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology, one of the highlights from that paper is that fathers who employed a more varied and diverse coping skill set reported greater involvement with their sons. And I think it's notable that this was in relation to school involvement, being able to advocate for their children in educational spaces, being able to talk to their teachers, advocate with the principals, meet with teachers, but also how they talked about race and culture more broadly. So as we talk about intergenerational processes, how fathers make sense of their fathering roles, how they think about this within the context of their own race-related experiences and the experiences of their children, we must also extend this out to the broader community and neighborhood context. And what I often think and refer to this as is harnessing community assets and strengths. So how I anchor and connect this discussion with the previous discussion is a quote from one of the fathers who participated in another one of the fathers who participated in our focus groups. And this father says, "We are not going to let you fail. One of the things that me and my wife do is if you come into our house, you are a part of our family, and we're going to treat you the same way we treat our kids." So the reason I use this quote is that it highlights fathers' agency and efficacy in engaging in a mentoring role as an important other, not for his children, but for children who reside in his community. And that there is a commitment to not just clear commitment to parenting treating them the same way they treat their own children, but also extending this to other children in their community and neighborhoods. And again, thinking about this father's role as a community asset, not just a father who is committed to parenting his own children, but the extension and agency in seeing the transformation or transformative elements in mentoring youth within their community. So we know in the literature that community assets, social support are key adaptive cultural coping strategies. And the broader literature focused on African American or Black samples has shown this both with adult and child populations. So the literature specific to Black boys has found that community assets and social supports are both promotive and protective, being related to positive well-being and school outcomes, adaptive racial identity, as well as social political engagement and empowerment, as well as decreased risk behavior. These again are promotive, community assets being directly linked to positive outcomes, but we also have seen in a number of studies that they're protective within the context of stressors, other neighborhood related risk, but also within the context of racial discrimination. So some of my work I think fits nicely in that discussion and highlights the role of community assets and mentor presence in the life of Black boys. And thinking about this both in a promotive and protective role. And so what we found in this study is that community and neighborhood support were associated with greater psychological well-being among Black boys. We also found that mentor presence was protective within the context of discrimination. So for boys who reported not having a mentor present in their lives, and we found this after controlling for a number of demographic factors, household, family factors. And that boys who reported not having access to a mentor, discrimination was associated with greater number of school suspensions. We saw a similar pattern for school engagement, such that boys reporting not having a mentor, discrimination was related to less school engagement. So I think also, and I'm not able to present all of the findings from this particular study, but what it suggests is that community factors are uniquely associated with outcomes for Black boys. Our study found exactly that. And that community support, mentor presence were uniquely related to well-being and school outcomes for Black boys. We also looked at girls in this sample, and another set of factors were promotive and protective for girls. In fact, father-daughter closeness emerged as a protective factor, promotive factor for Black girls in our sample. So some of my work also has identified mechanisms. In this specific example, empowerment beliefs. So what are the ways that community factors, in this specific case, community involvement? What are the ways in which, or what are the mechanisms that explain how community involvement and engagement are related to youth risk behaviors? And so what we found is that Black youth with greater involvement and engagement in their community, so participation in formal and informal community involvement, those youth reported greater empowerment. So empowerment is also efficacy in some sense. So these youth felt that they had more control over change in their communities, and youth who perceived that they had more control over changing their community or changing the world were less likely to engage in sexual risk behaviors. We didn't find the same pattern for substance use, but this study, I think, highlights the ways in which community involvement can have indirect impacts on health outcomes for Black youth. And I think also it contributes to the larger discussion regarding the importance of accessible and sustainable community-focused activities for youth. So as we talk about the role of social support, community assets for Black boys, we also see in the literature that these are important in several ways for Black men, and promotive with respect to well-being, in terms of mental health, other related health outcomes. We've also seen, and not just in the broader literature, but some of our own work, that fathers who are, that men who are mentors, who identify as role models or social fathers in their communities, as well as being engaged in their communities, their engagement in those activities allow them opportunities to self-reflect, to cope, to process their own experiences. And so if you remember, this is something that played out with our fathers, and that as they come to understand their children's experiences, they also begin to make sense of and reflect upon their own experiences. We also see in the literature that engagement in both mentoring and or community engagement expands social networks for Black men, which we know is related indirectly to well-being outcomes. We've seen links to empowerment, efficacy, as well as increased general well-being, psychological well-being, but we've also seen ways that this fosters physical health, so physical activity, both formally and informally. So meeting people in your social organization or your mentoring group and engaging in physical activity, for example. But again, there are various ways in which these relationships, indirectly and directly, can have and have shown to have impact for Black men. So as we talk about how we can support and promote well-being among Black boys, there are some just what I consider important considerations for how we support men and fathers, social fathers, mentors, as they support the next generation. And I think about this thinking about this as a multi-pronged approach. So acknowledging not just how fathers, social fathers, mentors, other important others engage with youth, right? So thinking about the quality of those interactions, but also thinking about what this might mean for the mentors or role models or father figures' own process as part of engaging in this relationship. Also, an important consideration is to think about both informal and formal structures. And as I said in the beginning of my talk, thinking about this from a lifespan and intergenerational perspective, and that what are the ways in which we can foster individual, family, and community level strengths and assets. And again, thinking about this as a reciprocal transactional process, as that, yes, we know that Fathers, father figures, social fathers can have impact on youth, but we also know is that youth experiences, youth in terms of their interactions and responses in these social interactions can have profound impacts on the mentors, the important others themselves. And so it is also, as we talk about community assets and the need to have sustainable structures that allow these to continue to have impacts, is that we must address multi-level and systemic factors that not only impact the well-being and health of Black men, but also impact the availability of these resources within our communities. And thinking about this in terms of advocacy and action and policy, and again thinking about formal structures that will allow these community assets to continue to thrive, to continue to promote positive well-being, not just specific to Black boys, but thinking broadly to communities and across the spectrum of youth. So as we talk about supporting and promoting the well-being of Black men and boys, we must also think about ways that we can support men, fathers, father figures, social fathers, role models, other important others as they support the next generation. So there are some key consideration, or what I consider to be key considerations for this to happen and for this to be sustainable. So thinking about this from a multi-pronged approach, again, thinking about the reciprocal transactional processes that often occur. So thinking about not only how adults have impacts on youth, but also the transformation that happens with adults and important others when they engage with youth. And so thinking about not just the mentoring relationship, but also what this might mean for one's processing, one's coping with their own experiences. Thinking also about informal and formal structures that allow men, fathers, father figures, other important adults to continue to support youth and promote well-being. Thinking about this from a lifespan and intergenerational perspective, not just with respect to mental health and well-being, but ways to foster individual, family, and community level strengths. And I think as we talk about community assets as well as these family factors, we cannot lose sight of the multi-level and systemic factors that impact the well-being and health of Black men and Black boys, but the systemic factors that have implications for families and communities and what this might mean for the availability of community resources, the availability and sustainability of community resources and/or assets. So quickly, I wanted to connect this to the current context. And as we talk about promoting well-being, we are in unprecedented times during this COVID-19 pandemic. And we're already seeing some exacerbation of existing inequities, but we see some very layered risk and stress that are having disproportional impacts on Black families and communities. And so some of our data that we collected in the summer highlights just this. So we collected data from a national sample of Black fathers across the United States in June or July, which it was a period of increased cases, consistent increase in the number of COVID-19 cases across the U.S. And so we found that almost half of our fathers were essential and frontline workers. Also, 30% worked in contexts that were considered high risk for contracting COVID-19. 30% also reported living with someone who also worked in a context that was high risk. Almost 30% of our fathers noted that at least one individual in their household had significant income loss during the pandemic. We also see that 34% of our fathers reported a personal COVID-19 diagnosis, and roughly 2 out of 10 reported a close relative, a spouse, a partner, a child, or a parent who had also been diagnosed. And so as we think about work, employment context, health impacts and health factors, we must also think about how this impacts families and how this might spill over, and what I have been saying, cascade into family and community context. And so thinking about this in terms of supports for families, so we see increased parenting stress and role strain with not just with both fathers and mothers. We also see the loss of support systems. And as we talk about support, the importance of support systems, we know that the loss of support systems have implications for how not just how families fare or individuals fare, but how communities fare in times of high stress. So I wanted to quickly end with some key take-home points. And so again, a lifespan and intergenerational approach is critical for understanding development, health, and well-being among Black men and boys, thinking about that with respect to parenting, but also coping, thinking about coping intergenerationally and the transmission of coping. Also, we must continue, both in terms of research and programming, continue to center the voices and experiences of Black men and boys. We must also think about fathering as a context for men's health. And again, we've talked about involvement in terms of impacts on children, but we are also seeing and have seen for quite some time in the data that parenting is transformative for many men, particularly men who feel efficacious and feel supported in this role. So thinking about how programming and policy can help to formalize some of these support structures, but also reflect the specific needs of Black fathers. Also, thinking about spaces and structures that support Black men as they support the next generation. And again, this goes with centering the voices and experiences. And as we think about programming or formalized structures or informal structures, we must also reflect their realities. So not just thinking about themselves as fathers, but we've seen time and time again in our data and several studies that fathers are constructing this role as a Black father who is raising a Black child, and that their negotiation of this role is very much so rooted in the broader race-related context. Thank you for inviting me to share my work at ICBME 2020. If you'd like to learn more about the work happening in my lab, the Strengths, Assets, and Resilience Lab, or the STAR Lab for short, please visit us at thestarlab.org or find us on Twitter. Thank you.
This Black strength that has carried us for decades, but is undermining an important aspect of our humanity and feeding in on itself. Being strong all the time took away our ability to speak about our weaknesses, our sadness, our mental illnesses. This silence is killing us. We stigmatize mental illness to preserve this place of our strength, damaging ourselves, and among Black children observing a spike in suicide rates.
A recent study shows suicide rates for Black children aged 5 to 12 were 2 times higher than white kids of the same age. Black and Hispanic children are less likely to get mental health care than white kids.
Mental illness affects everyone, regardless of sex, gender, income, or race. According to the Health and Human Services Office of Minority Health, African Americans are 20% more likely to experience serious mental health problems than the general population.
Doctors say growing up Black in America can be traumatic, and studies show that irritability in the average white teenager is often labeled as depression. But research shows that that same behavior is more likely to be seen as disruptive in Black or Latino children, and doctors say that can lead to feelings of hopelessness at a very young age.
Oftentimes in our community, we just write off as something else and we keep going.
In the Black community, well, we're massively overrepresented in the mental health institutions, even more so than in the prisons. And mental health is something that we don't talk about.
In the Black community, things like depression and likes are played down.
The more we increase our mental health, the better citizens we become, the better advocates we become.
There's a push in Nashville and across the nation to get more people in the Black community talking about depression, anxiety, and other stress disorders.
I think that in general, people get the help that they need, but especially the Black community.
Everything that was already wrong with you emotionally is made much worse by the fact that you're poor, that you maybe don't have access to education, that you don't have the economic privilege to go rehab and all them kind of things.
Because when Black life isn't valued enough for professional help, adequate housing, or even breathing, life here degrades in value in comparison to life after.
And mental health is real. All of us deal with it. And so it's now that we start talking about it, breaking those stigmas so people can get the help they need and we can have a community that's thriving rather than a community that's surviving.
We want to be physically healthy, spiritually healthy, financially healthy, but I can't do any of that if I'm not mentally healthy.
Greetings. My name is Dan Thomas, and I serve as the Program Director within the Todd Anthony Bell National Resource Center on the African American Male at The Ohio State University. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce one of today's keynote speakers, Dr. Rita Walker. Dr. Walker is a licensed psychologist and award-winning professor of psychology. She has published more than 60 scientific papers on the psychological risk and resilience in African American mental health. Dr. Walker has been cited in or appeared on a highly respected platforms such as Good Morning America, The Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and the Houston Chronicle. She has a recently released book titled The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. I present to you, Dr. Walker.
Greetings. I'm Dr. Rita Walker. I am professor of psychology at the University of Houston. I am licensed to practice as a clinical psychologist, though I don't necessarily maintain a clinical practice. I really get to have the best of multiple worlds. I retain or sustain an active program of research primarily around understanding risk and resilience associated with the African American community and risk and resilience in particular for crisis and suicide. But I also supervise doctoral students who are working on their PhDs. And so that's how I get to maintain multiple worlds. But more recently, I am the author of The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. And I'll say a little bit more about that. I'm certainly grateful for the invitation to have this conversation with regard to mental health. My talk today is Black Males, Mental Health, Suicide, and the State of the Culture. And I'm glad that in this context for the International Colloquium on Black Males in Education, that there is space in particular to talk about mental health. I've always been fascinated that we talk about our day-to-day lives and somehow leave out mental health in the conversation. So I'm glad to be talking about that today. I stumbled on this area of research in part because as someone who grew up and was raised in primarily African-American schools and neighborhoods and my family and church, when I went off to my undergraduate training at the University of Georgia, I just didn't feel like my reality was reflected in the undergraduate textbook. So I thought, okay, well, people say with an undergraduate degree in psychology, you can't do much anyway, so I guess I'll get a PhD. And with a PhD, I will better understand the state of what it means to be Black in America. And I'll tell you, I'm still trying to figure it out. But for today, what I do anticipate talking more about is recognizing the very much racialized context in which Black people and Black men in particular live in our society, recognizing that there is a paradox in suicide that we can talk about. I want to make sure that we understand just some of the findings from my research. And we'll really spend time with one study in particular that's important for this conversation, and then think about how can we get on track with respect to our psychological or emotional well-being. Now, when I tell people that I'm very much invested in the mental health of Black or African-American people, there tends to be this question of, well, what about all people or all minorities? And for many of you in this audience, you recognize that what it means to be Black in our society is very different from the context for other racial or ethnic groups. When I think about what it means to be a Black person, I go back to pre-colonial times before Black people were enslaved and where we actually came from, which was the West African continent, where we had culture, where we had family, and where we had tradition, and where we were brutally captured and enslaved and brought to the US and the Caribbean and other parts of the world, and forced to relinquish seemingly our cultural identity. But more importantly, we had to survive and we had to learn how to be human and take care of our families, take care of our responsibilities, and live. So the goal was to live and to pass on learning how to be able to survive in a society where our lives didn't matter. And we did that with community. We did that with family. We did that with our cultural traditions of, it's not just me, but my survival is about my community survival. I believe in a higher power and this sense of I can draw on something bigger than me in order to achieve what I need to in order to be able to not thrive, but at least survive. And we brought that with us in our cultural traditions. And I'll tell you, one of my favorite African proverbs is that no matter how long a log floats in the river, it'll never, ever be a crocodile. And I think the same is true for people of African descent, that no matter how long we are in the US or other parts of the diaspora, we will always have, whether it's been taught to us or not, that we will always have our Africanisms and our African cultural tradition. So recognizing all of that and thinking about the unique reality of Black people and Black men in our society. And when we think about not just in slavery, but the disempowerment and what it means for, as an example, a Black man who in his traditional culture, and again, this is pre-colonial West Africa, and having leadership and having responsibility of the family and having that taken away so much so that it can impact one's self-esteem and self-identity and what that does to the mind. And not just the mind for that person, but for generations. We talk about, or not we, but a lot of people talk about slavery like it was so long ago, and it would seem that way. But once slavery technically ended, we still had forced separation through Jim Crow laws. And so Black people weren't not segregated. I can't say integrated because integration never really happened. But we didn't start to intermingle more until relatively the last generation or generation and a half. And so when we think about what it took in order to be able to endure that and where we are as Black people now, we can't diminish the impact of that. Overwhelmingly, Black people have been exposed to violence-related trauma, and not just, in the time of slavery, but as we know, police-related trauma. And so the persons who are supposed to be protecting Black people are instead killing Black people. And what does that do to the psyche and to the mind? We know the statistics show that the vulnerability to developing trauma symptoms, and specifically post-traumatic stress disorder, is high. The severity of the symptoms are high. And because of understandable mistrust of psychological symptoms, getting help is harder to get. And there aren't as many providers, as an example, who are Black or who look like the person who needs the help the most. When we think about all of this in the context of just how can one even have a positive sense of identity or a positive sense of what it means to be a Black person in our society, that how does one achieve that without also potentially internalizing these ideas that, well, maybe there is something deficient about Black people. Maybe there is something deficient about Black men, minimizing this racialized context of survival. And what does that look like in 2020? What does it look like for the next generation that we need to desperately be cognizant of? Because of all of these things, it's challenging to not just maintain a positive sense of self-identity, but also self-esteem, which we know is related to a lot of different, or which is related to healthy psychological functioning. Now, with all of that said, and what we know as suicide researchers and scholars is that untreated psychological problems, a sense of marginalization, that is, you don't matter and your life doesn't matter, can translate to self-harm and suicide-related behavior, at least thoughts of one's own death. But when we look at some of the statistics, it would seem to suggest, and I'm showing a figure now, wherein we look at, in particular, suicide deaths for white, male, and female, and the combination for all racial ethnic groups, followed by white groups, then Black persons, Latinx or Hispanic persons, then Asian and American Indian or Alaska Native individuals, that by far the highest suicide rate is for persons who identify as Alaska Native or American Indian, followed by persons who identify as white. Given all of what I described and the history that people of African descent have experienced in the US and elsewhere in the diaspora, we would actually expect for the suicide death rate to be considerably higher. And that's where part of the paradox comes in, that despite lack of access to mental health care, despite overexposure to race-related trauma and underexposure to mental health treatment or adequate mental health treatment, we don't see the suicide death rates that we would necessarily expect in the African-American community. One of the things that I will point out, though, and what I appreciate about this particular figure, is that we see the disaggregated data by gender or sex for each group. But when we look at for non-Hispanic Black men, when we think overall, it looks like, 8.9 deaths per 100,000. So when we look at Black people as a whole, 8.9 deaths per 100,000. But what's driving that, if you notice, there's a considerable disparity between men and women, wherein men overwhelmingly are accounting for those suicide deaths. That's not to say that women aren't dying at all, but men are carrying a considerable burden of that suicide death. And so when we look at some of the other groups, as an example, Black men have a higher suicide death rate than the average. So when we look at everyone and we look at the combined group of 12.8 for everyone, Black men have a higher suicide death rate. And that's worth taking into consideration, though again, we would expect for it to be somewhat higher. My argument has been that when we pay attention to culture, that's where we see a lot of the resilience in Black people. That is the reason why we don't see suicide death rates as higher. Our identity is protective is because it provides an anchor, maybe not to our broader society that says Black lives might not matter, but it does provide a connection to other Black people. So a social anchor that says you are here for a reason and you have purpose in our society. And so even if the broader society isn't affirming what it means to be a Black person, having a connection to other Black people is powerful. And just thinking about not just people of African descent in the US, but around the world, and recognizing that it's not just us here. And we've seen that in recent months in response to the death of George Floyd, that was really very unfortunate. But around the world, there were Black people rallying for justice in response to his death. And then finally, a third point with regard to the importance of identity is how it really does seem to kind of buffer those messages that says Black people aren't worth anything, because there is this sense of kind of maybe us against them, and the us is Black people who have suffered for so incredibly long. But with all that being said, the reason that I wrote the Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health was because of an unexpected crisis that seemed to emerge. And with that crisis, what the research showed was that between 1993 and 2012, the suicide rate doubled for African-American children, while for European-American children, the rate actually seemed to decrease. And so these data first came out in 2016. And I was actually hoping, well, maybe it's just a blip on the screen. Maybe there's something strange going on here. And the data duplicated a couple years later. And what that said to me, as someone who's always been invested in understanding the risks and the resilience, was that maybe the resilience is eroding. Because at the end of the day, we do have some differences. And I think it's important to be aware of some of the statistics with regard to suicide for African Americans that makes it look a little bit different from that of other groups. Many may not realize that suicide is in fact a leading cause of death. And in particular, it's the third leading cause of death for African Americans aged 15 to 24 years old. When we look at suicide deaths for Black men in particular, it peaks at age 24, that age 24 or 25 to 44 age range. And that's important because if I could just draw my illustration here, when we think about suicide for, say, white or European American men, as age increases, so then does the suicide death rate. So starting at 0, younger ages, as white men age, the suicide death rate goes up. For Black men, the suicide death rate peaks about younger age, middle age, and then starts to go down. And when we think about someone who's, say, 30 years old compared to a white man who's, say, 65 years old who's dying by suicide, the risks likely differ. And it's worth understanding what is it that's going on in that early adulthood, in those teenage years, and even for our children. When I talked about those suicide death rates doubling, those were for 5 to 11-year-old children. What's going on? And so again, I've been looking at this work for some time now, but the data have been there for those who have been paying attention. One of the things that we know is that medically serious suicide attempts for African American men have surpassed that of European American men for some time now. And the medically serious suicide attempts are the ones in which the suicide attempt was so serious that had the person not gotten medical intervention, they would have died. And it's an important distinction as we try in our field to even understand suicide. There may be some of you who are asking, like, well, if someone does this, is that suicide? Like, how are we even thinking about suicide-related behavior? But before I move forward, I also want to mention that we do at least have some preliminary data or some preliminary statistics that would suggest that the risk factors aren't consistent. So the last point that I want to make on this slide is that drug use has been cited in fewer deaths for Black than for white, including Black and for white males preceding their death. So when toxicology reports or tests have been conducted, Black men were significantly less likely to have positive toxicology reports for any kind of drug. And some of you probably do realize that we have less actual substance abuse, despite what the media might suggest. We have less substance abuse, and it seems to have a much more delayed onset. So whereas some white kids might start drinking and using drugs earlier, we see a much more delayed onset for Black folks. But it's interestingly because we have more problems and challenges associated with that substance use. This question of suicide and what exactly is it? And imagine a scenario where a young Black man, let's say he's 19 years old, has gone off to college, and his high school sweetheart that he'd met in middle school breaks up with him. And he's so distraught by this breakup that he just feels like, I can't do this anymore. I'm so over it. And he takes a near full bottle of Tylenol PM. He just can't take the pain. He just got to remove himself from the pain and the hurt. And he's like, I just can't take it anymore. And he takes this full bottle or near full bottle. Is it a suicide attempt? Some might say, well, yeah. And some might say, I don't know. And some would say, well, no, it's no, for all sorts of reasons. But the definition of suicide that makes it challenging is that it is a death from injury, poisoning, or suffocation where there is evidence, explicit or implicit, that the injury was self-inflicted and the person intended to kill themselves. And herein lies the challenge of this work. That is, if we don't understand what was going on in the mind of the person and whether or not they intended to die, then we just don't know. And unfortunately, we have a lot of challenges with regard to understanding or even reporting and tracking suicide deaths, because oftentimes, unless we have some new mind reading skills, or if the person wrote a note, but there are relatively few notes, despite what popular TV shows would suggest, we don't always have access to suicide notes. And so we have underreporting of suicide deaths. We don't really know how frequently they're happening in the Black community. Oftentimes they're misreported as accidents. And in one of our studies, we found that especially for African-American men in that 25 to 44-year-old age group, that what was suspiciously a suicide was labeled, and these are national data, were labeled as accidents. And so it's hard to track what's going on if you've misidentified the cause of death. A lot of Black people still think, well, Black people don't do that, right? That's not something that happens. Over the years, I have consistently found that folks from younger generations are more accepting or understanding, but it doesn't necessarily translate to preventative behavior. And I'll make sure to say more about that before we go. Another question that I often get, or a question that frequently comes my way is, well, do you think there's a difference between real suicide and slow suicide? So maybe someone who is using substances and putting themselves in risky situations, that maybe they're slowly killing themselves, but that's not real suicide. And I do think that there's merit to that. We don't have enough research to support that, but there is some merit in thinking about the slow way that people kill themselves. But it's still problematic, because what it says to me is that we have a society of people in pain, and understandably so. And if I don't remember to say this later, folks, turn off the TV. Don't watch the violence against Black men, against Black women. It's vicariously traumatizing. The research has been consistent on that also. Turn it off. We don't have to be subjected to that. And there's so many ways in which we are hurt in our society. And we have to find ways to be intentional about protecting ourselves. So one of the things that I've been thinking about, if we could call it a logic model of understanding Black suicide, when we think about this idea or this experience of racism and how socially isolating and rejecting and alienating it is, and especially and including when Black people have to convince other people that something was racist, and just the disorientation that comes with saying, like, that was racist, and how painful that is to have to do that, especially when you're the subject of the racism. That there is something about that is psychologically disorienting, and based on some of our best theories, would suggest that someone is put in harm's way, or they become more vulnerable if they're dealing with symptoms of depression or anxiety, or they feel like their life doesn't matter and something stressful happens. And again, their life doesn't matter. How do they deal with that? And that puts them at risk. So when we think about, again, alienation and social rejection as being related to suicide, as several of our theories have suggested, it seems to me that when we experience more racism, we would see more suicide for both adolescent and adult persons in the US and around the world. Now, with my research, I've looked at factors that mitigated that or buffered or somehow thwarted that interaction. But for now, I'd like to talk more just about this idea of racism, which isn't new. Interestingly, in our society, there are folks who are kind of coming online like, oh, wow, racism is really bad. But Black people have been trying to figure out ways to navigate racism at work, in classrooms, in neighborhoods, driving while Black, doing all sorts of things while Black. And it's really, really very stressful. So one of the things that we had an opportunity to do when I was on faculty at University of Georgia some years ago was to look at longitudinal data with regard to experiences of racial discrimination in pre-adolescent girls and boys, because we know that the experience of racism starts really very early on. And so with this particular study, we looked not at suicide ideation strictly, but we broadened the definition to look at thoughts of death or morbid ideation, and also thoughts about one's suicide, recognizing that morbid ideation or death ideation exists on a spectrum. So it exists on a suicide ideation or suicide thought spectrum, such that morbid ideation, or the research has suggested that morbid ideation is basically a milder expression of suicide ideation, and it seems to be related to future suicide attempt behavior. So I wanted to look at whether or not racial discrimination was related to thoughts of death for boys and girls who were 10 years old, and then they were tracked again and data were collected a couple years later when they were 12 and a half years old. A lot of what was accounted for, and actually let me just make sure that I explain that when we asked these young children about racism, as an example, they were asked questions like, someone said something insulting to me because I'm African American. And so they were asked about this, in stores or at school, and that this happened in a number of different places. One of the things that was interesting and very intentional about this study is that we accounted for stressful things happening. So we attempted to account for whether or not a friend had moved away, or whether or not someone close had died, or whether or not they were having trouble in school. And so we asked all these questions as an attempt to account for a lot of bad things happening. And so when we asked about their thoughts of death, we asked two questions. The first was, in the last year, was there a time when you thought seriously about killing yourself? And the other was there a time when you often thought about death, or about people who had died, or about being dead yourself? So those were the two questions that we asked that was important with regard to assessing suicide and death ideation. And that was important because one of the things that I have found is that we have to be very thoughtful about how we ask people about their thoughts of death. Do you know how you would die if you died? And one of the things that we found was that certainly 63% of those children had no thoughts about suicide or death in any form, 63%. But about 2.5% actually thought about their own death and about dying. That was 17 children, and more than 200 children thought about death. Now keep in mind, children thinking about death after having controlled for all sorts of other stressful things happening, there was an association, and actually I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but there was an association between those children having experiences of racial discrimination and thinking about death. And thoughts about death in a 10-and-a-half-year-old doesn't seem like the direction that we want to go in. It's something that we want to pay much more attention to. The primary mechanism, and especially for Black boys in the sample, was anxiety. So sometimes we talk about experiences of depression and what depression looks like. And we think that if someone is sad or mopey or maybe not wanting to be bothered, that could mean that someone's vulnerable. But in these particular data, what we found was maybe it was more so worry and fear. It was anxiety that was the mechanism by which racial discrimination was related to thoughts of death. And so imagine, growing up Black in this society and recognizing what that could mean, that someone would understandably, or a child would understandably have some hypervigilance about what it means to be Black. Unfortunately, we found a longitudinal association. So we asked those children at age 10 about their racial discrimination, and we asked them at age 12 about their thoughts of death. And so we were able to track over a couple years and find this association. And it's important for us to be aware of this because these youth grow up to be teenagers and young adults. And we've seen the heightened suicide death rate for those age 25 to 44 and where it peaks. So what do we do? Just getting back, for me, thinking about basics and how Black people have endured so incredibly much in our society. And when I say getting back to the basics, that is understanding who we are as Black people and little Black boys having a sense of pride in what it means to be of African descent. I imagine that many of you have seen movies whereby the main character is lost, doesn't quite have a sense of, who they are, and they're trying to figure it out. They're frustrated. There are people around them saying, well, this is who you are. And there's this sense of rejection of just like, well, no, that's, for whatever reason. But then the person becomes the hero when they recognize who they are and they connect with the power that's within. Understandably, in our society, Black people have been forced to assimilate and adopt a foreign culture That is not intrinsically who we are, and constantly just trying to navigate what all of that means. And my research has consistently showed that for Black people who have a strong sense of community identity, so again, it's not just about me, but it's about my community, and have a belief in a higher power. And so I'm not on my own in this thing. I've got help. And being able to connect with that to make some sense of what it means to survive and thrive in our society, without being completely aimless and frustrated. And because remember, those African families brought their culture with them. So we have to start with realizing that Black people live in a very racialized context. I mean, we could say things like, well, it should be better than this, and they should accept Black people by now. We're not going anywhere. Well, that would be nice, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And once we recognize that we live in a very racialized society, that there are some things that we have control over that are internalized, and there's some things that we don't have control over. We don't have control over other people's racism. That has nothing to do with who Black boys are. The racist teacher says nothing about who that Black child is. It's all the responsibility of that teacher to address, and of parents and other persons who will hold our institutions accountable, so that that child can feel empowered. We have to know what our strengths are. I think that when we somehow seemingly were forced to leave behind our African culture, but it was more so leaving behind the labels. I always appreciate when I get to talk to students in my undergraduate Black psychology course about things that they do that are African that they may not have realized was African, like this sense that Black people are very spiritual. And I'm not saying religious, I'm not saying, going to some institution or house of prayer, every week. I'm saying just knowing that there is a higher power and that it's not random. Not one bit is it random for Black people. And this sense of, wow, like I came from something and my culture isn't just something from slavery, but that we are a meaningful people who have a meaningful sense of what it means to be successful and to achieve in our society. And that has to be, it has to be positive. We can't have a neutral sense about what it means to be Black. There was a study a series of studies that were conducted with students, and they split the students up into two groups. And in one group, they asked them about, their race, but they didn't say anything. They just asked them about their race. So they had a race prime. And in other groups, or it's a neutral race prime. And in the other group, the race prime was, Black people are successful. Black people are positive. Black people are creative and inventive. All true things. And who do you think performed better on the test that they were administered? The students who were told very positive things about what it meant to be Black. And that in and of itself seems very powerful for me, that when we begin to institute this way of thinking about what it means to be Black, we allow ourselves to be able to buffer and put off the impact of racism for which we have relatively little control. We have to be surrounded by people in community who are also really very positive, and not the ones who are neutral or who say, I don't even see you as Black. But instead, people who see Black people as we are and are willing to attribute the positivity of what that means. And sometimes that means accessing also our spiritual outlets and our spiritual resources, because there is power in recognizing, or at least that's what the research suggests, that there is power in recognizing that someone has access to a higher power, that is determining some of our strengths and some of our success in this society. So with that, thank you so very much for your attention. In my book, I do talk about racism, and I mentioned already that it's the suicide that concerns me for our children. But I think it's about having a larger commitment to rediscovering what it means to be a person of African descent. After we first recognize the impact of racism and race-related trauma on our society. So again, thank you for your attention, and I hope that you guys will have a very productive and successful colloquium. Take good care.
Tim Eatman here. I am delighted and honored by the invitation to share reflections with the International Colloquium on Black Males in Education community. Please receive my most heartfelt greetings, as well as a hearty salute to the planning team and ICBME leadership, in particular, Jelando Jackson and James Moore, my brothers beloved. Thank you for your leadership and vision. I've attended many of the ICBME gatherings over the years and considering them a highlight of my annual professional conference rhythm. The focus of the colloquium is increasingly more timely, especially now in these very challenging times. It was a blessing when I learned that ICBME would not be thwarted by the virus, but instead would convene virtually. Indeed, my sense is that ICBME energy is an important component of the vaccine, even if metaphorically, that vaccine that we need so desperately, an inoculant, if you will, against the racial virus that has been profoundly and ubiquitously illuminated in tandem with COVID-19. Perhaps some of you recognize John Coltrane's horn playing in the background. This is intentional. As I reflect on the current state of affairs, I'm struck by how essential a love supreme is for the fight and the healing that we need in our society. I have been challenging myself to beware the shrinking imagination. Beware the shrinking imagination. Pervasive sickness, death, nihilism, division, and strife can confuse and lure us away from a place of prophetic imagination and hope. And yet, we can choose to instead embrace our divinely endowed capacity to imagine and innovate through science and the arts, through loving and respecting each other across divides that literally serve to shrink us in so many ways. So ICBME community, I'm glad to be a part of a community like this, where an ethos of temerity abides. No matter how great the challenge, we walk in the legacy of so many greats who expect that we will rise to the challenge of consistent, rigorous, impactful knowledge production as publicly engaged scholars. As we continue along this way, let us remember to be true to ourselves, to take care of ourselves, to take care of ourselves. I close with an embarrassing revelation about my own shrinking imagination. After about the third or fourth time watching the literal murder of Brother George Floyd, I realized that I had observed his uncouth demise without flinching or even looking away. And that clearly my humanity is being compromised by not allowing myself to really understand and deeply connect with the depth of the challenges that we are facing, like state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown bodies. I watched the entire funeral of Brother Floyd until the tears started to flow. I could remind myself of the need to connect to my own humanity. Let us, as we think about the needs of support in our community, return again and again to a prophetic imagination that pivots on a love supreme. So excited to be with you. Walk in victory.
What an appropriate way to bring closure to the 2020 virtual International Colloquium on Black Males in Education. Not one, but two dynamic Black female scholars, whose work demonstrate the importance and power of partnership between Black male and female scholars to unite in order to build robust research agendas to inform critical advocacy with a focus on creating strong Black families and communities. Without question, we know that the plight of Black males in education cannot be improved without the assistance of our sisters of the Academy. Likewise, we challenge our allies and would-be allies to stand with us to eliminate racism, which has created the fundamental challenges addressed each week by our keynote speakers and respondents. I want to thank all the individuals behind the scenes who made it possible to bring the virtual International Colloquium on Black Males in Education to life. I also want to thank our sponsors and co-sponsors. We do not yet know what format the International Colloquium on Black Males in Education will be delivered in 2021, but we will commit to continue our journey together with you to chart new possibilities for Black males in education. Thank you.